Hey everyone, welcome to DataMillennials. I'm Atul, and in this video we are going to discuss about the explicit typecasting. So in our previous video we discussed about the implicit typecasting. Now in this video we are going to explore about the explicit typecasting in Python. So in explicit typecasting method, Python needs user involvement to convert the variable data type into a certain data type in order to perform the operation required. Mainly in explicit typecasting, the casting can be done with three different data type, and that is int, float, and string. So if we talk about int, then we have to use the int function, and int function takes either float or a string as an argument and returns the integer type object. Now if we talk about the float, then we have the float function in Python, which takes the integer or string as an argument and returns the float type object. Similarly, for string, there is a string function which will take the float or integer as an argument and return the string type object. So let's go and see the example one by one for each of these typecasting. So what we are going to do is that we are going to see the 6 different example of this explicit typecasting in Python. So the first example is how to convert from integer to complex. Okay, now let's assume that you have an integer value. Okay, let's say that we have an integer value that has 10. Okay, now in case if you need to convert it to the complex, then how can you do it? So let's first print the integer value so that we will be sure that the integer value has 10. Similarly, we'll print the type of integer value also. Let's print the type of integer value. Then we are going to convert it into complex data type. So let's say the resultant value will get stored in complex value is equal to. Now if you want to change it into complex, so we have to change this integer value into the complex data type. So we'll simply use a function complex in Python that will help us to explicitly cast the integer value into the complex data type. Now in this complex function we have to put the integer value that we want to change, and then let's print this complex value over here and the type of complex value. So let's run it. Okay, so the first thing that we are getting over here is 10, which is coming from this print statement, and we are printing the type of this integer value, so the type is int. Now we have changed this integer value to the complex value using this complex function, and we are getting 10 plus 0j, and that is coming because of this print statement. Now to check the type of this complex value, we had used this statement print type, and that's why we are getting that class as complex for this complex value. Okay, now let's talk about how to convert the float to complex. And before we go ahead with this float to complex data type, let's recap what is a complex data type. So a complex number contains an ordered pair, for example x plus ij, okay, where x and y denote the real and imaginary part respectively. For example, if we have a complex number like 2.14j, or let's say that we have 2.0 plus 2.3j, is the simple example of complex number. Okay, so over here we are going to cast the float data type into a complex data type with the help of a complex function. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to declare a new variable float value. In this float value I'm going to put 10.95. Okay, now let's print this. I'm just gonna copy paste this over here and put it over here, and I'm going to change this integer value with float value. Okay, now so we have declared a float value 10.95. We are printing that float value, then we are checking the type of this float value. Okay, Now we have to change it to complex. Okay, so again I'm going to put complex value as my variable in which I'm going to change it. So I have this float value which needs to be changed into complex, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to simply put complex function, and then I'm going to give the argument which is the float value. Now again we are going to print this complex value and the type of this complex value. So let's run it. So we are getting 10.95 as a float value, and this float value class is float. Then we have changed it into complex value which is 10.95 plus 0j, and because of this print statement we are getting the class of this complex value as complex. So let's move on to the another example of explicit typecasting, which is how to convert int data to string data type. So here we will be casting integer data type into a string data type with the help of a str function. So let's take an example that what is my birth year, or not my, let's say that there is a student X, so we'll say X birth year, and for this I'm going to put 2024. Now let's print this X birth year, and then let's print the type of this birth year. Okay, let's print it. So we have 2024 and class is int. Now we have to change this int value into string value. Okay, so what we are going to do, we are going to put strx birth year, my variable name. In this I'm simply going to put str function, or I'm going to use str function. Within this str function I'm going to put this x birth year as my argument, and then I'm going to print this string birth year value, and we are going to check the type of this string x birth year. So now over here you can see that the str x birth year contains 2024, but the class is string. Let's move to the next example, and in this example we are going to convert the string data type to int data type. Okay, and here we are casting the string data type into integer data type with the help of the int function. So we are going to take the same example. Let's say that we have this birth year where we actually have a numeric value, but it is in string format. Okay, so this birth year is a string variable, and let's test it out that whether this birth year is a string variable or not. So we are going to print this birth year, and then we are going to print the type of this birth year. So if I run this, you can see that we have 2024 and the class is a string. Now we have to change it into integer, right? So simply I'm going to put birth year new is equal to integer, and then we are going to put birth year as my argument for this integer function, and then we are going to print these two lines for birth year new. So let's put it over here and then let's run it. Now we have the same value 2024, but we have the class as int. So what is the use of changing this 2024 to integer type? So if you have a birth year, or let's say if you have a numeric data set or numeric column basically, which is saved as a string, on that column you cannot perform any arithmetic operation. So let's take an example. Let me put it as birth year 1. Okay, and let me print it. So you have birth year 2024. Okay, now if I add birth year 1 plus 5 years, what will happen? It will give us an error saying that you cannot concatenate a string with integer. So we wanted to add 5 year in this 2024, and we should get a result as 2029, right? But we are not getting it because this 2024 for this birth year 1 value is in string. So in order to get 2029 as our output, we need to change this birth year into integer. So if I simply put int over here and then if I add this 5, we'll get the value 2029. So what happens over here is that Python takes this birth year as a string first, and then it will convert this birth year into string class, and then it will add it. So that's a classic example that how we can use a string data type and change it into integer data type and then perform some calculations. Okay, now let's move on to the next example that we have over here to convert the string to a float. And here we are casting the string data type into float data type with the help of a float function. Okay, similarly, let's take an example that assume that you have invested some money. Okay, so let's say money invested, and let's say that the money invested value is 25,365.25. Okay, now this 25,365.25, ideally it should be a float value, but when you get data there might be possibility that it is in string. Okay, so if I print this money invested, and if I print the type of this money invested, then we can see that the money invested value is 25,365.25 and the class is a string. Now we need to change it into float so that we can perform some arithmetical operations, right? So in order to do that, simply put money invested actual equal to, we'll use the float function and then we'll put this money invested from here. We'll take this money invested and put it over here as the argument for this float function. And now if I print this money invested actual and type of this money invested actual, then we are getting float. So if I take this money invested, okay, and if I add let's say 50,000 to it, we'll get an error, type error, saying that can only concatenate string with to string and not to the integer. So if I put float over here and then if I add 50,000 to this money invested, then we'll get the value 75,365.25. Now let's move to the last example for this video that we have, is that how we can convert float to string. Okay, let's take a simple example of this one only. Okay, so if we want to print this 75 or this 25,365 into a statement saying that you have invested 25,365.25 rupees, then in that case what we need to do is that we need to convert that float into string. So let's take an example saying that we have money invested as 25,365. Okay, now we wanted to print simply that total money invested is this much. We can do that, that's not an issue. So if I simply put print total money invested is equal to, if I put money invested and let me comment it out the rest of the statements. So now if I run it, you will see that we are getting that in the print statement. That is not an issue. But sometimes what happens is that we have to change integer or float value to a string in order to fulfill certain requirement during our data processing. So we'll take a simple example that we have money invested is this much, okay, and we want to change it into string. So if I print this, you can see that we have the class as float for this money invested variable. Now if I change it to string, let's say money invested in string, then what we can do is that we can simply use the str function and we'll put the argument which is money invested. And now if I simply take this money invested in str and print this value over here and check the type of this value, then we should get string, and the printed statement for this money invested in str should be a string value. So we are getting the class as str. So this is how basically you can change the float into string value. So this is a simple example for explicit typecasting in Python. Happy learning and see you in the next video.